Right, so we are back for the second half of this edition of What if you're listening on audio. If you're watching on video, hi, I'm JR.
I'm John.
And I'm Simon.
So this is, if you've not seen one of these before, where we as a team kind of take ourselves back in time through Doctor Who history to certain sort of nexus points, things that happened in the show where what happened behind the scenes took what happened on the screen in certain directions, and we ask, if things had gone slightly differently, would things have turned out very differently, and what kind of an effect might that have had on the future of the program? Because we're recording this immediately after the giggle, I'd kind of like to start with something that Russell T Davies brought up, which kind of fits in with the sort of theme of What If, before we get into the actual question that I was going to address in this one. And we're probably only going to be about 20 minutes in total, because these are not sort of substantial questions that we're digging into necessarily. But the Russell T Davies thing is this, and I haven't had chance to see it yet as we record, so I'm basically going on hearsay from what people are talking about. And it's this: in the commentary for the giggle, when talking about the bi-generation that happened, Russell T Davies suggests, and I believe the way he said it is probably like this, but the way it's been repeated by fans who are tearing their hair out about the fact that he said it makes it sound like he laid it down as a sort of diktat. This is the way things are, and anybody who argues with me will rot in hell, and all this kind of stuff. I suspect what he probably said was, I'm talking in a commentary, so anything I say here now is not on screen, so it's not validated as part of a canon, but as the writer of it, this is how I see it, and this is my headcanon, and you're welcome to join me in my headcanon if you so wish. And what he said is this, and the reason I bring it up is because as soon as I heard it, it made utter sense for a particular reason, and I want to bring that up, and then I want to ask you two what you think of what I've made of what he said and how that affects what we see on screen, or might not. So what he said was, when the bi-generation happened with Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa, he said the same bi-generation could have sort of retconningly backwards affected all the previous regenerations. In other words, when Tom Baker turned into Peter Davison, a version of Tom Baker somewhere might have gone on as a Doctor living into old age until sort of the loop that we talked about worked its way out, and he goes back in time to regenerate into the Peter Davison that we get. And I think that makes real sense, because, right, going back to something that we've talked about a little bit before, and John and I both mentioned this on our podcast about the giggle, actually, we talked about when we had these feelings about how transmat beams works, and this has been something that's bothered me ever since I was about 14 or something. If a transmat has a person at one end and they take the atoms apart and then send the information and then reassemble new atoms at the other end to recreate the person, you have killed the person at one end, and the person at the other end might have the memories, but it's a brand new person. It's not the same person. Now, I've always thought that. Stephen Moffat kind of confirms that that's how he sees transmat working in Heaven Sent. Why I think that's relevant, and sort of we kind of didn't quite allude to this, but I think it is relevant, is that regeneration, I've always felt regeneration kind of works the same way, in that it's not the same person just with a changed face, but it is a brand new person just built out of the atoms of the old person, but the atoms are so reconfigured, it's a brand new person. So the old person, the fourth Doctor, does die, and the fifth Doctor is a brand new person being born out of the same atoms. Now, Russell T Davies actually confirmed that's how he feels about regeneration too, when he said, was it in the Eccleston one, where he said the old person will die and all the atoms will be reborn at the same time and a brand new person will be there. He kind of said that. I think it was that one. It might have been the Tennant one. I think it was
End of time. It's a brand new man walks away, wasn't it?
Oh, was it End of Time? Right, there you go. But it's there in Russell T Davies, so he confirms that's how he thinks of it. How I think that becomes relevant then to the idea of bi-generation. Oh, and by the way, somebody wrote into a podcast I was listening to, I think it was Radio Free Scaro, and said, surely the reason why this happens anyway is because the presence of the toy maker means that things that are only myth can become reality. So they even mentioned that bi-generation is a myth, and it becomes reality on screen in front of us. And I think Russell T Davies is right, therefore, that could go back through the Doctor's timeline. And if you think about each Doctor being made of a certain set of atoms and that Doctor dying and brand new atoms coalesce to form a new Doctor, then the idea of that Doctor, the old Doctor, the one who dies, continuing afterwards and keeping his atoms so that it's all new atoms that create the new Doctor, kind of becomes logical, if a little difficult to actually think of mechanically, but psychologically and sort of physiologically in some ways, I think it makes perfect sense. So I think what Russell T Davies has done, whether deliberately or not, but I think probably relatively deliberately, I think he's made even more sense of regeneration than he did when he did that whole shtick about the atoms die and it's brand new atoms, therefore it's a brand new person. So I am 100% on board with the bi-generation, and I'm also 100% on board with the fact that you might have aging versions of Peter Davison and Sylvester McCoy and Matt Smith somewhere out in the universe ready to turn up if he ever wants to use them, or somebody does at any time. I think it's wonderful, frankly.
I think this is why I think I said on the giggle, Russell T Davies thinks like a viewer. He has that, he has the structure, he has the skill, he has the talent of a writer, but he thinks like a viewer. He thinks, how do I get rid of the boring bits of the script? And sometimes that's to the detriment of the script, occasionally, where you might want a little more explanation. And I think the giggle thing, has opened up the way he's thinking about Doctor Who. It's not about, it's a science fiction, although that will be in the mix. I think this is something Ian Levine went nuts about. He wants to show off diehard fans when he talked about episode 2 being a fantasy. But But in that interview, the next line is, but the next episode's science fiction one. So I think Russell's open. He's opening up Doctor Who to almost a different way of thinking about the writing, where you don't necessarily need a science fiction explanation, which might scare the viewer off. And this concept of bi-regeneration is a really good way of going. We can tell stories now with any old Doctor, and we do not need some explanation of why they're about. It's cutting out the boring bit.
Well, for sure. And I don't think he's done it because he necessarily has plans to do any of that. But I think
he's really good at opening up options for himself.
Exactly, just as Stephen Moffat did when he did the time differential thing in Time Crash. And Stephen Moffat's often opened up doors. He opened up doors for a woman Doctor, and even in the way he did it, he said, "Oh, I was," when he does the regeneration of
General in Hellbent.
Hellbent, yeah. He even has that thing where the character says, "Oh, I was a woman every single time. I tried being a man once. It was terrible. It didn't work. I've gone back to being a woman." Perfect way to leave the door open for the Doctor to turn into a woman after being a man 11 times in a row, because it shows that it happens. And that's how you open doors. Simon, what do you think about everything that we've just said? And also, bonus question for you, Simon. So going back to the what if nature of what this podcast's supposed to be about, what do you think of all this stuff? And would you like to see older Doctors come back in some way? And if so, beyond just sort of Tales from the TARDIS? And if so, how would you like that to be? Would you like it to be as a main role? Would you like it to be in the main series? Would you like it to be as just guests in a spin-off series? Is there something you'd quite like to see?
Yes and no. I was going to say was we've kind of seen it, haven't we? That the setup with the two Doctors, it makes perfect sense of that then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened at the end of the War Games, is they took off this other version, the older version of the Doctor, and gave him missions and what have you. But I was going to say that going back to what you were saying about where the Doctor actually dies and becomes, a new person replaces them, makes perfect sense story wise and character wise. Otherwise, where's the jeopardy?
Yeah, absolutely. People always say, "Oh, the Doctor could never die." That's not really true. Not in any sense. Not in a sort of metatextual, here's the
No.
actor being replaced sense, or any sense.
No, otherwise you end up with Captain Jack, getting himself shot and then giving everyone a wink that actually I'm not dead.
Yeah.
So no. So yes, the Doctor does die each time, and that's why David Tennant gets so upset every time.
I just want to point out at this point that it isn't David Tennant absolutely every time, just every other time.
Yeah. This is it. As far as using it as a way of spinning things off, I don't quite know how you explain that to a normal audience member.
I think he did. Do you know what I mean? So he did it in a commentary on a podcast, but I think he was 9/10 of the way there with the giggle. He just didn't put the sort of final nuts into place so that it all sort of fell into place for the viewer. But I think he got so close to it that he's left it ambiguous deliberately, because he might not pick up on it. Somebody else might. They might want to do something different. But I think he's got close enough that if he ever does want to pick up on it, all he has to do is just shove the final few words in to bring off the explanation.
I mean, personally, I'd like the by regeneration to be a unique thing, because for me, I've been thinking about it like I do, and for me, it was about shedding a skin as much as it was about it being a by regeneration. So it's about almost like a cleansing thing to then the shooting up by Doctor to then move on without taking a lot of the baggage with him.
And that's fair, because also the Toymaker won't be there next time. So presumably next time it'll be back to being a clean break between two characters. But having said that, Tales from the TARDIS is something that most of us, I think, have enjoyed, and sort of the bi-generation going backwards and allowing all those characters to have aged kind of makes sense of that too. So I don't know, I'm fully on board with that aspect. I think you're right though, Simon. I think thinking of the previous Doctors as having had a second existence is fine. Thinking of all future Doctors as having a second existence, probably less fine. Let's let future showrunners decide what they want to do with the future Doctors. What Russell T Davies has done is for only the Doctors up to this point, I think makes the most sense.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing to me is there a story to be told with them? What can you tell a certain story with, Peter Davison's Doctor or Colin Baker's Doctor that you couldn't tell with in the modern era with, say, Tennant or Smith? But
So
just the contrast.
To answer that question, I'd quite like to see one of those old Doctors as somebody who retired like 30 years ago and has been pottering around in garden centres for 30 years or whatever, suddenly becomes part of a unit story or something. And so you get, I think you could do a lovely variation, a sort of septuagenarian variation on a fish out of water story, where you've got a retired Doctor who's forgotten how to do all this stuff and is like 70 something years old.
Have you ever heard cottage stuff?
Yeah. I don't know, because it's a long time since I heard that. But yeah. So I think that would be the way to go with it. Have a Sylvester McCoy or a Peter Davison.
Well, you could do it with the Tennant Doctor in 20 years down the line.
Yeah, for sure. Get caught up in a sort of unit spin-off story or something.
Well, and it's easy enough because Donna is a member of UNIT, or we assume she will be. So, you can.
Elle certainly is.
As soon as he sat down to that table, I thought, oh my God, we've got a Pertwee set up again.
Yes. Well, you would stick with Mel Bush anyway. She is obviously now an ongoing permanent member of UNIT. And Russell T Davies asked on the official Doctor Who podcast, he asked them to come up with suggestions, because the suggestion from him was he's going to bring in more previous characters to be permanent members of Unit 2, so that the unit staff can be made up of some new characters and a bunch of old characters from time to time when Unit appears. But given the expense of the Unit sets, it's going to be an ongoing part of the series like it was in the 70s. Not as frequently as in the 70s, perhaps, but
To give
certainly,
credit here, it's part of the legacy of Power of the Doctor, isn't it? With that companions organisation, you can easily draw that round.
I think that's exactly what he plans to do. I don't think it'll be all of them, clearly.
No.
But I mean, I would be very surprised now if Mel Bush wasn't augmented by at least one other ex-companion or ex-semi-regular character or something as part of that team. Should we actually move on to the other bit? Otherwise, we're going to run out of time before we get there. We had a question. I'm going to read the question out. And this is going to be rather interesting. The question says, what might have happened if Stephen Moffat had left the series after Series 9 as originally intended, with Chris Chibnall unable to take up his position as his replacement for another couple of years? What might the BBC have done? And that seems to have come in from a listener called John Arnold.
Never heard of it.
Interesting. I mean, wonderful question. God knows the mind that it came out of.
Twisted. Cerebellum like a spiral staircase.
But the funny thing is about this is that we almost did have this situation, didn't we? So Stephen Moffat was planning to leave after Series 9. In fact, he was going to do Series 9, and The Husbands of River Song was what he decided would be his swan song, like a little epilogue to Stephen Moffat's time on Doctor Who, where you round out the River Song storyline and give Peter Capaldi's Doctor a potential retirement, such that, I suppose, you could probably have done that sort of big no-no and ended with a non-regeneration, with Peter Capaldi riding off into the sunset with River Song, only for Chris Chibnall to turn up 18 months later with a brand new Doctor who doesn't get a regeneration sequence, who just comes in situ and starts telling stories. I think that's how things would have gone if that had been the handover. But when Chris Chibnall got the pull back to ITV to have to sort of finish off Broadchurch with the third series, and was therefore not going to be 18 months behind Stephen Moffat, but sort of 2.5, 3 years, whatever it turned out to be, then something else had to happen. And so, John, your question is, what might have happened? But we kind of know what would have happened because we've heard what the BBC were doing.
Yes. We know that they interviewed other writers to come in.
Yeah. I don't want to go into names because I don't think
not at all. I think that's unfair. I don't know if they're out there. I have no idea what about that. So
I don't know if any of them are on the record. What we do know is that the BBC, after Chris Chibnall said, I'm going to be late, at least a year late, whatever, 18 months late, the BBC said, well, we don't want Doctor Who to go off air for 3 years before Chris Chibnall comes back with his first one. Curiously enough, almost exactly what they've just done now with Russell T Davies, though, right?
13 months.
Oh, no, between series, it's 2.5 years, John.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, that's essentially what we'd have been looking at, about 2.5 years, 3 years between series. So pretty much exactly what's happened now. But they didn't want that then. So what they did was they wanted to, and I think this is kind of a little bit disrespectful towards the writers, but then again, if this is the proviso that you're going in to be interviewed for, I suppose it doesn't come down to respect, but it comes down to necessity. But the BBC spoke to at least 3 writers. Now, as I understand it, they didn't get down to sort of final interview stage, but the idea was each of these 3 writers, and possibly more for all I know, but we know of 3, were asked by the BBC to go away to come up with a plan for what they would do if they were in charge of Doctor Who for a single year, just one series, and to come back with the BBC and say, right, this is how my series would look. And the BBC would then go to choose the one that they preferred of these 3, or however many it was, proposals to go forward and be a single year showrunnership of Doctor Who before Chris Chibnall came in. Utterly balmy when you say it out loud, and yet I suppose it must have come relatively close to happening before conversations with Stephen Moffat eventually came back to, yes, I'll come back. We also heard some pretty nasty stuff about Peter Capaldi as well, and I don't know quite how true that was. It has been said out loud on another podcast, and I've heard certain things about it from a mutual friend as well. So, not to put too
That's
fine a
the-
point on it, Peter Capaldi was at some point let go, and then at some point made to come back. And the way it all went down wasn't particularly pretty. And probably let's finish that one there. But Peter
Yeah.
Capaldi wouldn't have gone further than the Husbands of Riversong under Plan A or Plan B. But when Plan C came about, and it was Stephen Moffat who ended up doing the 10th series, Peter Capaldi came back. So here then is my question to the two of you. You've got 3 writers. Let's narrow it down. Let's each of us pick a writer, and let's not suggest necessarily what we think a story arc would have been, but let's each choose a writer and say, I'll start because I've had time to think of this, before pinning it on the two of you. I'll come up with a writer and I'll say a little bit about how I think their Doctor Who might have been. And obviously, I'm clearly going to pick Peter Harness, right? Because I've been batting for him to be a Doctor Who showrunner for years. I've always wanted him ever since Kill the Moon. I loved Kill the Moon, and I loved the fact that Kill the Moon sort of dealt with things a little bit in the way that Russell T Davies is doing now, and the Zygon two-parter even more so. So I think more has been made than is strictly probably there to be made of the specificity of the Zygon two-parter and its political allusions. But I like the idea that Peter Harness is somebody who does political allusions. Even Pyramid at the End of the World, which I didn't think worked particularly well, but even that had political leaders coming together to try and sort of, come up to some kind of compromise deal, whatever, to broker something to deal with the alien threat. Again,
story structure that's interesting with that. It's telling a different story. I like that imagination of his stories.
Well, and that happens too in the Zygon inversion. And although that's co-written with Stephen Moffat, it still shows that Peter Harness is the kind of writer who can be involved in stories that do that slightly strange structure thing that's such a part of Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who. So Peter Harness, I think, would come up with a version of Doctor Who that included the tricksiness of Stephen Moffat, but included the sort of issues-led thing that we've got happening now with Russell T Davies and that we had with Chris Chibnall too. So with Peter Harness, I think we'd have had a sort of best of all worlds approach. Might not have been quite as witty as Moffat or quite as heartfelt as Davies, but I think it would have straddled a nice middle ground between all 3 of the actual showrunners we've had. So I'd love to have seen a Peter Harness version of Doctor Who. Now, either of you two ready to say another name and give a few thoughts about what it might have looked like? Or you want me to throw a name at you, unfortunately?
You can do.
I was going to mention, and this is a fan fiction or a fan unmentionable, but the idea of Neil Gaiman being in charge of a whole season, I think would have been really quite a curious thing. I think it would have been far more traditional than maybe you might think, because I think his leanings towards Doctor Who are far more I think he's quite big on memory of Doctor Who in his childhood.
Do you know what, Simon? This kind of goes back to something that I think I brought up on Saturday when we were talking about the Giggle and about how I think Russell T Davies is repurposing it. And listening back to that episode after, I came to the realization that I could have boiled it down to 5 words. I think what Russell T Davies is trying to repurpose Doctor Who as is Roald Dahl does science fiction. And I think your Neil Gaiman version of Doctor Who would basically have been that. Roald Dahl does science fiction, yeah? Because he wouldn't have done quite what he does in his own stories. He would have done a sort of science fiction-y Doctor Who-y version of that. I think that's where it would have been.
I think Neil comes from a fantasy background, though. So I think, again, it's very much what I was thinking. You get this
when I say
fantasy element that Russell's bringing in.
Yeah, when I say does science fiction, I'm speaking very loosely.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it would be a more fantastical one, I think. It would be more by the rules of fairy tales and mythology. And again, I think that's where Russell's got I think that's where he'll go in the Christmas special, I suspect. I
Oh,
don't know
yeah.
anything about it. Certainly with the Devil's Cord, by all accounts.
Well, and goblins, right? Just
Yeah.
the idea of goblins on a pirate ship, right?
Yeah, you just look at it as a normal thing.
But equally, I think it would have possibly leaned into things like the Black and White Guardian. Maybe they would have made a reappearance or something like that.
Not going to spoil anything, but Russell T Davies also talked about bringing back, and he didn't mention any names, but he definitely alluded to the Eternals, the Guardians, the Master of the Land of Fiction. He
It's
said,
the episode, isn't it?
he's basically said he's going to be bringing back more than one of those characters at some point in the future as part of a grand conspiracy between the Celestial Toymaker and other godlike beings in the series, essentially. Simon, any more you want to add about Neil Gaiman? Do you think there's anything? Because I think the question that you kind of raise without realizing it is, what would he have done about a companion? Because Neil Gaiman, the kind of stories he writes, I don't think we'd have had a traditional companion necessarily. So could it have been that he might have done something slightly interesting in a companion? Oh, and just on that point, you know, all the people who complained about Amy Pond and Clara Oswald being, oh, Stephen Moffat, he does companions that are just really not actually characters, but they're just sort of like enigmas waiting to be solved. I think we're going to see Russell T Davies's version of that in the very next episode, aren't we?
Like the same.
Wasn't Donna that as well?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I think Rose was to an extent too, Frank. But
doesn't start that way, but does go that way, yeah.
I mean, Bad Wolf, Rose turning into the Bad Wolf, is exactly what Stephen Moffat does with Amy Pond and Clara Oswald, isn't it? So the precedents are there.
There's no change.
Anyway, yeah, could you see Neil Gaiman doing something like that with the companion, or maybe even something even slightly further left field?
No, he might, whether he would have had like a Victorian companion or someone like that, or somebody who came from a completely different background to just a girl picked up from Earth, or maybe somebody a bit more quirky. I don't know, but yeah.
I'm just thinking of Coraline, where it's like, you know, the lead girl in that is like so. Yeah, I wonder if he'd have not obviously sort of like turn into a button creature, but do you know what I mean? Somebody who has a kind of background that I could see Neil Gaiman doing the Doctor Who's first sort of like underaged companion, now clearly played by an actor of 17 or 18, but playing 13 or 14 and having a child run off with the Doctor, a child who maybe becomes orphaned at the start of the story or something.
Over the space of a year, you know, over the space of one season, then you could tell that story, wouldn't you?
I think so, yeah.
The whole idea of getting them home.
Right, going to have to march on because I said we'd be done in exactly the amount of minutes that leaves. We've got 20 seconds left to hear John's suggestion.
Well, the quicker I was going to go with either Mark Gates or Jed Mercurio. I think Jed Mercurio would be kind of a more thriller, a more faster pace, or maybe a harder sci-fi one. Kind of maybe Invasion. Did he have that to do with Invasion Earth? That series in the 90s?
That was Mercurio,
something along those lines. And the other one I was going to suggest is Mark Gatiss, who I think would go for a very kind of traditional approach compared to the others. Kind of that reminiscent of the Saturday Tea Time, Tom Baker era, maybe even. So horror elements, but very kind of cup of tea, maybe less ongoing elements than we used to with Doctor Who, sort of self-contained stories, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Right. I do feel like I underserved you a little bit at the end there, John. But I feel like
hearing that from me, Simon was much better to hear from.
But we were all a full enough part of the conversation before that.
Absolutely.
I don't feel that bad about it. Right, until we come back and do this kind of thing all over again. I was JR.
I was John.
And I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.